All right, guys, this is a video that needs no introduction. These are the top 10 craziest card effects that were in the game before the game launched to a public beta. Even if you played in the public test periods at the time, I promise you are not going to remember all 10 of these alternate card effects. Like, I was looking through them and some of them are just completely crazy and I had completely forgotten about. So without further ado, to kick off my top 10 list, number 10, the box. The box, God, what to say about this card? The box was a crazy card during these test periods. The box was a 4-mana burst speed spell that, for the duration of the round, reduced enemies by 1 attack, and for the rest of that round, when the enemy summons a unit, it would immediately take 4 damage. A completely bizarre old ability that there's nothing like that in the game even to this day. And I mean, this is kind of a good entry to kick off the list because with a lot of things on this list, it's hard to tell whether something is a buff or a nerf, right? Like, we don't know whether this is it's really hard to say exactly how good this would have been or even what the applications are. I mean, this old version of the box you could use with fearsomes in conjunction with stuff like Skitterer or Nocturne. You have the ability to, delete fearsome blockers by minus attacking the opponent's units. It can be a combat trick because it's a burst speed thing that affects the stats. But the most interesting use of this old version of the box is pre-development into your attack. If you're on like a mid to late game turn, like turn 7 or 8 or so, and you want to develop a couple of units into your attack, you can start your turn with the box and then play your unit ready to maybe double develop, and you're effectively locking your opponent out of playing certain kinds of defenders because it'll automatically deal 4 damage to them instantly if that happens. So if the opponent plays like an Arachnoid Sentry to stop your attack, well, they're still getting the stun, but they lose the blocker. Number 9. All right. This is where things start getting a little bit crazy. Assembly Bot. Old Assembly Bot was a 3-mana 2/2. Whenever you cast a 6 or higher cost spell, create a copy of me in hand, then grant allied Assembly Bots everywhere +1/+1. An absolutely ridiculous old effect, and you obviously were meant to build an entire deck around these 6+ cost spells and Assembly Bots, cloning them and buffing them sort of like you do with Legion Marauders. Now, Assembly Bot, this one is actually one that I have a particular affinity to because I actually, in the early patch version, when it had this effect, played a deck that ran Assembly Bots in this fashion with this old effect. Obviously, it was extremely short-lived, but it was a lot of fun. And while this concept wouldn't be, competitive, it's definitely fun to imagine what the game would look like right now if you could swarm a bunch of Assembly Bots and just keep vomiting them from your hands, buffing every time. Number 8. So this is one that a lot of people actually remember. Kalista did get a nerf somewhere along the way, and her old version read, I bond with an ally, it takes all damage for me. So you didn't have to level Kalista up to do this. This was just her original play effects. And when she levels up in the same way that she does now, then you have the ability to attack and revive that bonded ally if it's dead and re-bond with it. So she didn't have the fearsome in this form, and she only had 2 health on her first form. This is one out of all of these that I actually kind of miss. Kalista was a lot more interesting when, when you play her originally. She has some kind of effect with this like bond, this like damage link. And of course, her leveled up form is pretty close to the same. It's just like a revival, and the unit that you're reviving takes damage for you. So usually the Kalista ends up getting blocked and the unit dies during the same combat step. But this initial play ability was pretty cool at the time, even though she didn't have the fearsome keyword. Number 7, Lux and Final Spark. Old Lux was actually a really enigmatic champion. So in her old form, she was a 5-mana 5/3, completely different stats. And to level her up, you have to cast 6 mana in a round with spells, not just, overall. And you don't create a Final Spark right away when she leveled up. But the leveled up Lux, whenever you attacked, it would create a fleeting Final Spark. And most importantly, Final Spark used to be a fast speed spell. So what that means is you could cast it during combat after you attacked with that Lux, right? So your Lux would create the Final Spark, your opponent would designate blockers, and you'd be able to play that Final Spark on that combat right there with Overwhelm. And Final Spark used to do 6 damage instead of 4. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that her Final Spark used to also cost 6 mana instead of 0. So old Lux was probably not great in this form either. Ultimately, the fact that she cost 1 less mana is nice, but as funny as it is to imagine attacking with Lux and instantly during that combat casting a 6 damage Final Spark, the 6 mana cost of this card just makes it even more clunky than Lux is right now. Number 6, Cloud Drinker. Cloud Drinker used to be a 6 mana 3/7, and in addition to its current ability, your burst spells cost 1 mana less. It used to have, when you're enlightened, your spells cost 2 less instead. So obviously we can imagine some crazy combos with this once you reach enlightenment and all your spells are costing 2 mana less. There can definitely be some popping off combos with decks of like the Karma style, which we have seen competitive in the past, where you can start just basically vomiting out your entire hands, especially when you have spells like the Karma Champion spell inside of Ages costing 0 mana instead of 2. Things can get pretty ridiculous pretty fast. And of course, with Targon having access to so many just cycling 2 mana burst speed spells, Guiding Touch and Pale Cascade being the big ones, but Targon is just all cheap burst cost spells. Cloud Drinker actually starts becoming pretty funny in an archetype built around it with Targon there. Probably would not be competitive, but with everything costing 2 mana less, it's definitely funny to imagine a world that could have been. A world with Cloud Drinker and Lightning and spamming your entire deck at your opponent in 1 turn. Number 5, Precious Pet. Precious Pet tore me up inside when it got this change. When I'm summoned, stun the next enemy unit summoned this round. For the same card, stats-wise, it was a 1 mana 2/1 that had this ability. It was actually pretty crazy. You could start with Precious Pet as a 1 mana card and effectively just lock your opponent out of being able to play a proper development that turn. They couldn't play a blocker or they couldn't proceed to play an additional attacker. It's just an amazing effect with that on top of its spider keyword and already efficient stat line. And ultimately, it is a good thing that they changed this. This definitely would have been insane, but at the time, I think it was a pretty cool concept, and I'd like to see some kinds of similar effects be implemented into the game in maybe a less toxic way. Number 4, Glimpse Beyond. So we all know the story of Glimpse Beyond. This is an incredibly powerful card. It's always throughout the history of this game been basically an auto-include 3 of in most forms of Shadow Isles decks. But what if I were to tell you that Glimpse Beyond used to be burst speed? Absolutely ridiculous. Completely uncounterable. You can counter anything your opponent is playing without a potential re-response. If they go into, try to give you a dragon kick or try to give you a concussive palm, you can just say nope to that. It's gone at burst speed. You get to draw your 2. Obviously, this was a completely necessary change. And usually they don't change card speed. That's actually a pretty rare thing for them to do. But in this case, Glimpse just could not have existed in any sort of healthy way at burst. And it actually is sort of surprising that this card was ever designed to be burst speed, because when you look at Glimpse and the design of its dynamics and the counterplay with it, it just makes so much sense for this card to be a fast speed card. It really is perfect that way. At burst, that is a major no-no for me. Number 3, Thresh. Old Thresh was a pretty crazy concept. It would read, when an enemy dies, heal me 1. So unlike the current version of Thresh, he's self-sustaining and he only has to see 3 enemies die to level up. Now, you can't have your own units die to trigger its level up. It has to see enemies die, But what that means is old Thresh would have been much more fitting for control style decks, which normally can't really run Thresh because they don't have enough units on their side of the board, right? But for a control style deck, you know, with Shadow Isles Freljord as it's most currently being run, but in the past we've seen control Shadow Isles P and Z, we absolutely could have run this previous incarnation of Thresh in that style, particularly with him being self-sustaining and healing potentially to full every single turn as you're sweeping the enemy board with your control tools. And of course, on level up, as you do maintain the ability to heal, you still get to be able to pull out a champion from your deck. Its level up has not changed from the current version. And honestly, I gotta say for this one, this actually feels like a version of Thresh that could work fairly well right now in this current metagame and in the way Shadow Isles decks are currently built. The fact that current Thresh has to see 6 units die instead of just seeing enemies die actually does make him pretty limiting. You do have to run him in Shadow Isles decks that play more for like some amount of board swarm, which is pretty rare. That's not really what Shadow Isles wants to do as a region for the most part right now. There's a couple of decks that do, but not the kinds of decks that are playing Thresh, right? Those are like the aggro styles. And, you know, the fact that he's healing a little bit is fine. It might have been crazy a little bit in the past, but current version of Thresh right now is kind of in need of a little love. And I honestly think this is like a weird thing looking through past versions and actually coming to like, wow, this could make sense right now. But absolutely, I don't see any reason this old version of Thresh couldn't effectively replace Thresh right now as a bit of a minor upgrade. But that brings us to number 2. Intimidating Roar. God, this card was nuts. There's only 4 letters changed on this card. It is now slow speed, as we know and love, but back in the day, this card was fast speed, and that was absolutely crazy. It is hard to explain. I know Intimidating Roar, it's not really seen as a competitive card. It's run sometimes in like Yasuo style decks, but Yasuo decks are like meme decks, and also Roar is not even necessarily good in Yasuo decks, right? So it's crazy to imagine this card being some semblance of competitive or having some qualities of it. But man, if Roar is fast speed, suddenly it shut down so many strategies. If the opponent is playing an aggro deck, say bye-bye to an entire attack. You try to attack into this Roar, and it just shuts down your entire attack. Imagine this with even something like current modern versions of Scouts, like MF Scouts. So much of that deck just gets shut out. Like, they start with a Scout attack, you would Roar, and immediately stun everything. Their entire deck is 4 or less power, even with Grand Plaza most of the time. That's absolutely ridiculous. And of course, you can use this on offense. We see a lot of Overwhelm style decks running Decisive Maneuver, because when you stun an Overwhelm blocker, a blocker to an Overwhelm unit, the Overwhelm goes all the way through, right? You would absolutely be able to run a fast speed intimidating Roar as an offensive punch through for a Noxus Overwhelm deck. So at fast speed, this card becomes ridiculous overnight. It's an insane concept for a card. And of course, you know, at slow speed, it just doesn't really work very well. It's relegated to like one Stamina meme archetype, but I think that's probably for the best. At fast speed, this card would just be crazy. And finally, that brings us to number 1, Anivia. Anivia, wow, what a card. Back in the day, back in the time of the pre-testing, there were a lot of people freaking out about Anivia, and it's hard to say in hindsight whether that was justified or not, but old Anivia was really strong in a few ways that current Anivia just doesn't do anymore. It got effectively almost completely reworked. Anivia was a 6 mana 4/3 that can't block, and it did a similar thing with its attack. You deal 1 to all enemies, it would have the same skill, and when it leveled up, it would deal 2 to all enemies instead. But the way it worked was very, very different, because when you had the egg, when Anivia died and hatched into the egg, it would very simply, at the start of your round, level up and hatch into the big Anivia. You did not need to be enlightened. You could play Anivia on turn 6. You could start cheating it out and resurrecting multiple Anivias. You did not need to get to 10 mana. it was a 4-3, so it had some semblance of offensive pressure, and you could start immediately racing down the opponent with multiple cloned Anivias from a very, very early point in the game. Because she was still 6 mana back then. They nerfed her to 7 and then buffed her again to 6, but again, she worked in a different form. She needs to be enlightened now. She didn't back then. What that means, and there were some decks, I built a deck a very long time ago to try to fully abuse this, and the concept is just Oblivious Islander cheating out Anivia even earlier. You can play Anivia as early as like turn 4, and running stuff like Entreat as well to be able to just reliably get it. So like an all-in combo deck where you just cheat out your Anivia reliably on like turn 4. You start, once it's sacrificed, you can start cloning it with Shadow Isles package tools. You've got, your Mist Calls. You've got your Chronicler of Ruin. Anything you want in Shadow Isles to be able to resurrect or clone certain things from a very early turn of the game. And you'd just be able to start barreling down your opponent with multiple leveled Anivias on like turn 5. An absolutely insane card that I honestly kind of forgot about until now, going through all these old cards. Overall, the ability to cheat out Anivia so early and so reliably and just start that cloning engine proved to be really, really disastrous in the playtesting period. There were a lot of people abusing Anivia, and I mean, it's really hard to tell if that, would be competitive in certain environments, but at least at that point in time, it was absolutely crazy, and a lot of people actually got fed up with it. I mean, there were people running Anivia decks there, and it was just ridiculous how fast they could run you over. Again, I know I'm stressing this, but turn 4 multiple Anivias is the nut draw there. Like think about that. It was absolutely crazy. So Anivia got taken down a notch, never to be seen again, which again, like a lot of the changes on this list, is almost certainly for the best. I think Anivia is in a fairly healthy spot right now. Definitely not, too crazy as a champion. One of the weaker ones overall, but I gotta say, I definitely prefer it to how things could have ended up. All right, so this was it. This was my top 10 crazy old card effects video. That's about all I got for this video. See ya.